We turn to 2 Kings chapter 6, first few verses. And the sons of the prophets said unto Elisha, Behold now, the place where we dwell with thee is too strait for us. Let us go, we pray thee, unto Jordan, and take thence every man a beam, and let us make us a place there, where we may dwell. And he answered, Go ye. And one said, Be content, I pray thee, and go with thy servants. And he answered, I will go. And so he went with them. And when they came to Jordan, they cut down wood. But as one was felling a beam, the axe head fell into the water. And he cried and said, Alas, master, for it was borrowed. And the man of God said, Where fell it? And he shewed him the place. And he cut down a stick and cast it in thither. And the iron did swim. Therefore said he, Take it up to thee. And he put out his hand and took it. A well-known miracle, of course very popular in children's Bibles. It's a miracle of aid, helping out, similar in that sense to the miracle of healing the water in Jericho, or multiplying the oil, or the healing of this poisonous pottage that we read about a while ago. It's a similar miracle. But when you read this, you must ask yourself, what's the purpose? Why did this happen? First of all, if we look at the axe, that's what it's about. The axe that is borrowed and lost. There is a need for the axe to have it. That is the first thing that we can see, and then it's lost, and finally it's retrieved. So first of all, there's a need. Why is there a need? It says that the place where the sons of the prophets dwelt had become too small. It's too strait, it says here, but this is what it means. Too small. That means that many students had joined the school. They had become so many that the place where they stayed was too small to house all of them. And that's an interesting observation if you look at the beginning of Elisha's ministry, where there was this skepticism whether he would actually be the rightful successor of Elisha. There's a shift from the skepticism to acceptance of his authority, to giving him actually credit of the things that he achieved, or that God allowed him to achieve. And now he had gotten a great influence and a reputation of his own. There's no longer any mentioning of Elisha. Not that they had forgotten him, but there is a valued successor. So the way that these sons of the prophets respond to the changed situation is, we can take it as an example in the church in general. Because there are changes. Through time there are changes in the church, and change can be growth, like here, but it can also be diminishing of the church. And how do you respond to that? And I have three things to mention. First of all, they faced the situation. They recognized there is something that needs to be done. Something has changed. The place was too small. And they did not try to fit in everyone in the old place, or to try to somehow expand the old place where they were used to. And it doesn't say here whether this was in Gilgal or in Jericho. It must be either one, because it was near to Jordan. But if it was in Jericho, we read in the story of the healing of the waters that it was a pleasant place. They said it's a pleasant place, only the water. But of course now the water was healed. So anyway, they were content where they were, but it was too small, and they didn't try to stay there at all costs. So they rather made something new from scratch, literally from scratch. And this is something that the church, I'm not talking obviously about any institution, but the body of Christ, this is something that the church must do, adapt to the circumstances, recognize the circumstances and adapt to the circumstances. Even if, actually as we do today with the pandemic and all the things that come with it, we have to face the situation and adapt accordingly. And in other places in the world there is lots of persecution. Also the people there, they adapt to the situation. And they might have to go underground, or all kinds of things happen in order for them to be able to continue. So facing the situation is one thing. The second thing is they were willing to do an effort. They didn't sit back and, well, we have a problem, God has to fix it. No, they were willing to do an effort. It says, as we read, let's go make a place and then to the Jordan, and it says every man a beam. Every man. It was not a small group of builders. Every man was involved. And that shows two conditions you need to do work, a project. You have to have unity of spirit. There has to be team spirit, so to speak, in modern terms, but you have to be in unity. But there also has to be individual willingness. Every man has to be willing to do his part. And so it's exactly what we see in the church when it's correct. We work to a common end. We are one body, as Paul writes to the Corinthians, 1 Corinthians 12, one body, but all members individually with different tasks. Each doing his individual part as God leads. So that is the second thing. They were willing to do effort. And the third thing is also interesting because they ask, or not really, basically they ask indirectly Elisha whether it's okay, whether he gives his approval. And he says, go ye, go ahead. The end of verse 2, but they didn't stop there. They don't stop there. They say, no, we want you actually to come with us. And why is that? Well, there are reasons for the growth, for why the place that they were was too small. And the reason is in large part due to Elisha, because of his influence and his work. They had grown in number. And so they didn't want to leave him out, they wanted him to be there. They didn't only want his approval, but they also wanted his presence there. And it is not just a matter of being kind, showing him their respect, which they did, of course, but it's also acknowledging his authority. That is very much what it is. And that is an important thing. There is a God-given authority, hierarchy. I mentioned it also in other instances past weeks, and it is important for the members to recognize that and to respect that, because that's how the church functions. And so when the church makes changes, the head cannot be excluded. And ultimately the head always is Christ, of course. As it says in Ephesians 4, verse 15, which is the head, even Christ. So that is why they needed tools. They had to do work, job to do, and so they needed tools. And so they go ahead to do their job. And they were working hard, and it doesn't say explicitly, but we may assume that Elisha was not just sitting on a rock supervising their work. He was probably working with them. He knew how to work. Remember when Elisha called him first, he was plowing the field with 12 yoke of oxen. He was working hard. He knew how to work. And so he must have also here worked together with them. But whenever there is work done, there is also waste. There is also often some setbacks, some accidents. These things happen. And one was felling with much force, and what happens? The head of the axe flew off the beam. We have here axe in Hebrew, by the way. It's not called axe. It's called barzel, and this means iron. So it literally says the iron flew off the heave. But from the work that they were doing, from the context, we understand it's an axe and not a hammer, for example, which would have the same name. Now, this is not an uncommon thing to happen. Even now, today, if you work with an axe or with a hammer, this might happen. This piece of iron is attached to a wooden handle, and with much force, and then it can fly off. And then it becomes a very dangerous and deadly projectile. And this happened quite often, actually. Interesting enough, even in the law, in Deuteronomy, we find a provision when such an accident would happen. So it was something that happened more often. In Deuteronomy chapter 19, in verse 5, we find this. This section, this chapter is, or this part at least, is about refugee cities that they made in the land, where people could go that had caused a deadly accident. They were not punished, but they had to leave wherever they were, and they could then continue to live in these refugee cities. And so it says there in verse 5, as when a man goeth into the wood with his neighbor to hew wood, and his hand fetcheth a stroke with the axe to cut down the tree, and the head slippeth from the helve, and lighteth upon his neighbor, that he die, he shall flee unto one of those cities and live. So the fact that we see a provision in the law, in the Torah, for this kind of accidents shows that this happened quite often, actually. So it was not a strange thing that happened here. It was actually to be expected. When so many men were working all there, then these things would happen. But fortunately, no one was hit by this axe head, but it landed in the water, in a deep part of the river. But to make things worse, it was borrowed. It was not owned by the sons of the prophets. And that again is part of the message that we get here. It's an important detail. It was not his own property, it was borrowed. And obviously, it was not owned by any of the sons of the prophets. He hadn't borrowed it from another student there, because they were all in the same job. It was borrowed from outside their community. And this makes sense. They normally had no use for such tools. Certainly not so many that all of them could work. They might have had a few, but not so many. And so someone had lended to this young man out of goodwill. You're good guys, you do good work, you can use my tools. But this made it even more painful, because this person had showed his goodwill and now they could not give it back. And this shows the danger of borrowing. When you borrow something, you have to really think twice. Who am I borrowing it from, and what if I can't pay back? And this is even more so when Christians create a debt with non-Christians, with non-believers. Whether it's a physical debt or a financial debt or a moral debt, when you create such debt with unbelievers, you're in a dangerous place. Why? Because you create dependency. And that is a type of dependency that actually should not exist. We should try to be as independent of others as we can. In particular, regarding those outside the church. There's a clear reason. King Solomon writes in Proverbs 22 in verse 7, "The rich ruleth over the poor, and the borrower is servant to the lender." Oh, that's very clear. The one who borrows is a servant to the lender. So in a way, this son of the prophet had become a servant of whoever he borrowed this axe from. Our dependency should only be with the Lord. And you see this example of borrowing, the church borrowing from unbelievers, you see it a lot. On a large scale, it's obvious. Many churches have loans with banks to finance their buildings and their whole operation. And when you do so, you're depending on these banks, and they can actually set the rules on how you use these buildings. Most churches are official institutions that use tax exemption or tax benefit from the government. It's an indirect form of taking a loan, creating a dependency. And you see that governments are now dictating the churches what to preach, what not to preach, and in general how to operate. And basically the church cannot say anything, because if they do, they lose their benefit, they lose the buildings, whatever it may be. So this is creating a dependency that actually should not exist. And of course this happens also on individual level when Christians borrow money, goods, or even time from unbelievers. It's a dangerous thing, and it could have been avoided, by the way, but I'll get to that. So this is the first thing, and it was not his own property. There is a dependency that should not be there. Secondly, and this is what makes it bad, of course, is that the loss could not be replaced. Obviously, because if it could be replaced, then there was no need to borrow it to begin with. The sons of the prophets were poor. We've seen this in the past stories. They didn't have much. That's why he borrowed an axe. He didn't buy it, he borrowed it. Axe head was not a big thing, but it's very difficult to produce in those days. To get the iron and to melt it and make it in this shape, it was a lot of work. So it's hard to replace. And so this young man, he was very sorrowed about this. And that is a good thing, that he was lamenting. He was realizing the problem that was here at hand. It says something about his conscientiousness. In Luke 16, there is a very good truth written there, which I know it also as a saying, and actually I think of it many times. He that is faithful in that which is least is faithful also in much, and he that is unjust in the least is unjust also in much. So this man was lamenting over a relatively small thing, but that showed something of his heart, that he would also care about the bigger things. And that's a good thing, actually. And it's really something to think about yourself also. Do I care about little things? And if you don't, then you're probably not fit also to have responsible over bigger things. This really goes hand in hand. It's the attitude. So, this is the problem here. It could not be replaced, at least not easily. And the third result of this, losing this axe head, is that the work was interrupted. The whole purpose of having this axe head was to do work, and this work could not be done now. What you see here, and this connects with the first thing I said, this dependency, you see here that God's work depends on instruments that are not from God. And this is a very bad thing. This is a very bad thing. And this is what this young man caused. God's work depended on instruments provided by men outside of the church. So that is an error when we think we do God's work, or we do God's work, but we make it dependent on unbelievers. We are making a mistake. It's a totally different thing of what we read a few weeks ago, that someone out of the blue, so to speak, comes to bring bread to the sons of the prophets. That's a different thing. That is God providing. God could also have brought someone here to give them tools. But that didn't happen. It was here this young man himself who probably went out to seek where can I borrow an axe. So he had created this dependency. And he was rightfully grieved, not only because he could not pay back now, but also because he could not do the work of God. If we as believers are not grieved when we cannot do the work of God, something's wrong. And of course, again, when it is because of our own fault, it's more sore. Now, this man, what did he have in his hand? As soon as the axe head flew off, he had the handle in his hand. It's just a wooden stick. And this is actually what he was working with, what he was holding. But now it had become useless. And this is really something to think about. Many, if not most Christians are just waving around handles without the axe head on it. And they're actually making maybe a lot of fuss, but they're not doing anything effectively. And why is that? Because the instrument is not from God. The instrument that they use is not from God. Many have ministries, it's not from God. They're waving around and making a lot of fuss with these handles, but there's no instrument on it. Many may use their talents, fulfill their desires and say it is for God, but it's not from God. And so they're just waving around empty handles. The axe head was lost. And now it had to be recovered, replaced somehow. And there is an interesting thing in when you read this. The axe falls into the water, and the man doesn't go to Elisha to ask for help or to explain what happened. He says only one thing. Alas, master, because it was borrowed. That's what he says. This implies that Elisha knew what happened. He saw it happening actually. Otherwise, he would have said, I lost my axe in the water and it was borrowed. But he didn't say it. Only it was borrowed. So it was in sight of Elisha. And so the man does not need to explain anything, he just needs to mention the actual real problem. What is the real problem? The problem is not that the axe head is lost, the problem is that it was borrowed. This is the problem. And I pointed this out before. He hadn't gone to Elisha beforehand, before they started the job, to say, well, we have so many men, but we don't have enough tools. He didn't discuss beforehand how God would provide for the instruments that they would need. He thought, I can solve the problem myself. I go out and I find someone who has an axe and I will borrow it. And now he had a much bigger problem. And now he thinks of God. Now he turns to Elisha. And now he thinks of the God-given hierarchy of authority. Master, he says, it was borrowed. Now he understands the route actually he should have taken from the beginning. What can we do now? That is basically what he asks between the lines. What now? It was borrowed. What now? Well, what now? The answer is, now we do what we should have done all along. We turn to the Lord. This is how we should have begun. And then the miracle happens, and the way it happens is also very, very telling and meaningful. First of all, there is human involvement. God steps in now, but that doesn't mean that he tells man to step aside. He doesn't say, okay, you messed up, move away, I will fix it. No, he involves the person. And so this all happens, of course, through Elisha, who is now again called in verse 6, the man of God, showing us clearly that it's God that's speaking here. He says, where fell it? Where did it fall? Now, from many sides you would say this is a silly question. First of all, he saw it. He saw it fall, apparently. So there's no need to ask it. Secondly, if God was able to make it float, he will also be able to know where it was. So why ask this question? Well, the only reason is to involve the person into the solution, to make him verbalize what happened. Where fell it? The man was now actively involved. He had to point to the place where it happened, where it fell. And then after the iron surfaces, again, it doesn't miraculously appear back on the handle, it floats to the surface. And then Elisha says, take it to thee. Take it up to thee, in verse 7. He had to take it out himself. And just try to imagine what a weird sensation it would be to take a piece of floating iron out of the water. Something that actually is not supposed to float. He felt it with his own hands, and he felt the power of God that he had not called upon from the beginning. So when we forget to involve God, because that's what happened here, when we forget to involve God, God often involves us. And that is his way of reminding us and of teaching us. That's the first thing we see. The second thing is what we've seen also in the other miracles. It's very simple means. There is no complicated ritual or formula. It's simple. Before we saw the healing of the water in Jericho, it's just some salt that he threw in the water, or in the poisoned pot it's a bit of meal. Very simple things. To Naaman he said, just dip yourself in the Jordan 7 times. It was nothing difficult, nothing complicated. And this time he does something else. He cuts a stick and throws it in the water on the place, in the same spot where the axe head fell. And so you think, what is this unnecessary action? Why not just make the axe head flow right away? But as in the other miracles, it is a natural thing that points to the supernatural. And it does so in different ways. He cut a stick. That is, Elisha cut a stick. And he threw it in the water. What happened to the stick when he threw it in the water? It doesn't say, but what do you think that happened? When you throw a stick in the water, what happens? It floats. Yeah. It floats. Why does it float? Because that's what wood does. When you throw it in the water, it floats. It's natural. So God is showing this is what happens when you throw wood in the water. It floats naturally. And in the same way, the iron sank naturally and would float supernaturally. God was showing here a contrast. Why does wood float on the water and iron sink? This is because of the first law of Archimedes, or Archimedes' principle it's called. When you immerse an object into a liquid, fully or partially, it will experience an upward force, buoyance, it's called this force, that is equal to the volume of the displaced liquid. I remember this literally in Dutch. It was one of the most interesting formulas or principles I found back in high school when I first learned it. And this is how we can calculate how ships will, or whether they will float or not, and how deep it will be in the water when you load it with certain cargo, etc. It's a very common principle, and when it was put into words by Archimedes, it was actually very profound, because with this, for example, they could detect fake gold from real gold, because fake gold has a different weight when you submerge it into. So you could compare it with real gold, and you see that there was a difference. So it's a very interesting principle, but it's nothing more than describing what we usually call the laws of nature, the laws that God created in the nature, in the environment that we live in. But now the wood was floating according to these laws. The iron had sunk, but would float contrary to this law, supernaturally. Up till this point, the whole project was without any supernatural intervention. The man had thought of the idea, let's build a new housing for us. They journeyed to the Jordan. They were cutting wood. They were working everything with natural force and with their own skills and force. And there's nothing wrong with that. Actually, we often do not require any supernatural intervention. And we should also not expect supernatural intervention. Why? Because God has given us our natural environment, our skills, our abilities, our brains, so that we can do things naturally, without this intervention. Intervention is something different than guidance. There was no supernatural intervention, but at least this one young man, he had forgotten to call upon God's guidance. So, what we need is that. It's His guidance and His direction and His blessing. We don't necessarily need His supernatural intervention. But when it is necessary, and mostly that is due to our own errors, then God is there to intervene. And that's what happens. Now there is supernatural power. It says the iron did swim or float. So how did this happen? And people try to come up with ideas. He must have used this piece of wood that he cut to poke into the water to fish it up. Some say, but it's not what the word says. Or maybe he did away with Archimedes' principle. Well, he did not. Why? Because the wooden stick that he cut was floating. And the water was still water, the wood was still wood, so the principle was in place. The laws of nature were there. Others will say, maybe he turned the axe head into wood. When the wooden stick hit the water, the axe head turned into wood and it began to float. But a wooden axe head is actually useless. So that would also not, that's also not an explanation. It's God's laws of nature. They're actually not the laws of nature, they're the laws of God. And they are an instrument of God, in God's hands. And He created them, He made them for His purpose, and to create for us an environment in which we can operate. But they are His, and so He can do with them whatever He pleases. And in this case, He created another force. This is the supernatural force, the power of God, another force that countered the effect of gravity on this iron, and it made it rise to the surface. And so he could take it out, and the problem was solved. What we see here is that this man, he thought, well, an axe is just a little thing. I will fix this problem. I will get one from one of my neighbors or whatever. And if we think that we do not need God for small things, if we think we can fix small things ourselves without consulting God, without God's direction, then we are in error, actually. And you see here that things can turn out very bad if we do so. We should never try to fix the circumstances for ourselves, and certainly not by depending on unbelievers. There's nothing wrong with interacting with unbelievers and of course evangelizing them, and it's also nothing wrong necessarily, say this with some care, to accept things from them when they are offered to us, but we have to use lots of wisdom here. And what we in any case always have to do is follow God's direction, even in accepting things from anyone for that matter. Not to just assume right away, this must be a blessing from God. Maybe this is what this young man thought. I go to my neighbor, and if he has an axe, then I accept that as a blessing of God. But that's nice, but that's his thought. It's not necessarily the truth. So God shows here in this story that he cares about small things. Actually, he shows that he does not want to be excluded from the small things in our lives. He wants to be part of it. And this only makes sense. If you're a parent, you know how this is. You don't want your children to exclude you from anything. Not because you want to know, but because you care. And you want to be involved and to make sure things will go in the right way. And so God does not like to be excluded. And certainly not if it concerns his work. They were doing his work. And so to exclude him from that, it even doesn't make sense. With God there is no such thing as small or big, the way we think of it. And this is very encouraging and comforting for us. We can put all our wants and needs in his hands, all of them. If it's just a small axe that seems so insignificant, but yes, even this. He's not limited. He shows it here also. We are limited, but he's not. The man thought he could fix the problem by borrowing this axe, but as soon as it fell into the water, just a small, simple accident, he had a problem that he could not fix himself. So we are very limited, even if we think we have everything under control. We have to learn to trust him for the small things, and then he will do big things. Amen.